Hello, friends. Patrick MacFarlane here of the Liberty Weekly podcast, and welcome back to another episode. This episode is episode 123, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/123. I'm very excited to be joined by a special guest, and that is DK Williams of the Law Podcast.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. I appreciate it, Patrick.
Awesome. Well, why don't you just quick introduce yourself? You had a pretty short bio on your page, but there's a little bit more to it than that.
Yeah, I'll give you some broad strokes, and you can ask me any questions, and I'll give you whatever details that you might want to know about. But I went to undergraduate, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, so I'm a big Tar Heel fan, and then I stayed there and went to law school. So I got out of college in '89, straight through, then law school in '92. Clerked for a federal magistrate judge in Raleigh, which was a great experience, and then I went back to my hometown of Greensboro, where I did insurance defense work. And so it was a good way to get into courtrooms and do depositions and things like that for a young lawyer. And my boss, my partner back then when I was a young lawyer, he loved being in the courtroom, and he started to take appointed criminal cases, like murders, right? I mean, serious stuff. And since he was my boss, I got into it because I was going with him. So that got me into some criminal law, and I got on the appointed list for my local county. That's how they did it back then in North Carolina. Here in Colorado, there's a statewide organization that does it statewide there by county. At least it was 20 years ago, or however long ago that was. And then I did with his connections, or because he was the boss, I started getting into some death penalty appeals as well. So I didn't do any death penalty trials, but I did some appeals, and actually got to argue before the North Carolina Supreme Court on a death penalty appeal case. It didn't get him a new trial, I'll find him innocent or anything like that, but it did set a procedural standard that is still, it deals with how much and what the government, the state has to turn over to a death penalty, somebody who's been convicted of a capital crime. So that was cool. I got to argue a death penalty case before the North Carolina Supreme Court and won that. Since then, I have also done the personal injury side of insurance defense. And I like to just tell people it's like a football game. You can play offense, you can play defense, but it's the same game, right? It's the same rules. I've done some family law recently, but mostly what I'm doing now is helping out small businesses and their government compliance issues, reviewing contracts for them, that type of thing. Not nearly as exciting as it used to be when I was doing federal. I did federal criminal cases too. I was on the appointed list for the Eastern District and the Middle District of North Carolina for federal for the CGA panel. You know, when people can't afford their own lawyer, the federal public defender gets the first name on the indictment. And often there's more than one, so they can only represent one of them. Beyond that, then they'll hand it out to the appointed lawyers, and I was on that list and represented worked in some a lot of drug cases primarily. This is in the '90s, and also a couple of bank robbery cases. One illegal possession of a firearm case, was dealing with an ATF agent. So that was cool. That was exciting. Glad I did that stuff. Now I'm much more laid back when my beard got white, much more laid back and cool.
Yeah, well, I got to hand it to you. That's a lot of different practice areas. And when I first started out, so I did 7 months in a smaller firm, and I did, everything,
Yeah.
from family law to the public defender appointees on
Right.
like the private bar, what you were talking about,
Yep.
and
Yep.
all the contract work and the small claims stuff too. So it's really, when you're first starting out, it's really hard to master all those different areas when you're just trying to figure out which way is up and everything.
Yep.
Um,
Indeed.
yeah. So, well, what I'm primarily doing now is the personal injury plaintiff side of it,
Right.
and
Sure. Absolutely.
I'd like to expand into the civil rights side of it, but a little bit more, because at least the branch of our practice that is in the city where I'm practicing, it doesn't specialize in the civil rights stuff, but generally that's what the firm is known for.
Right.
So
Right.
what made you decide to be a lawyer?
Um, well, my mother is a professional musician, and my father has a PhD in organic chemistry. And since I didn't get any of their talents or abilities, I really didn't have much choice except to become a lawyer. It was just kind of what I thought I was going to be somehow growing up. I think they encouraged me to go that direction, and I enjoyed it. And so it was never a time where I just decided to do it. I just kind of that was what I was going to do um, uh, from a young age. Pointed that direction, and I stayed going that way.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
And well, how about when did you become a libertarian then?
I think I've always had that inclination without putting a name on it. At least when I was in high school or before that. So I had that inclination. I think I became I call a self-identified as a libertarian probably during college. Now, I know that's true because I know I went to some libertarian meetings for like campus libertarians for the first time. And what I remember is, hearing the words. First time I ever heard of objectivism was my freshman year, sitting at a bar listening to some other fellow freshmen who I hadn't known before, and they were talking about Ayn Rand. And so I'm like, oh, this sounds pretty cool. I'd never read her at that point. And so I said, that sounds pretty cool. I better check this out. So I did. That's when I started learning about what objectivism is, how it's different from libertarianism, and went more that way. Yeah, I'm more that way. Though I understand how overlap they are in many, many, many areas. And I've kind of gotten into. I read a little bit about how the whole Murray Rothbard and Ayn Rand relationship, how they were friends for a
Yeah.
while, yeah, and hung out and they were cool. And then Murray went the other way. So I would have gone with Murray in that group of friends. So that's where it started. Yeah, I do remember going to a that like Carolina Libertarian meeting at one point. And I think about that same time, I actually one of my first activism things is at college. I'm pretty sure, and I helped get Steve Forbes' signatures to get on the Republican ballot, however long ago that was. So that was like my first thing I did when I went out, and I actually recruited like 4 or 5 other people and went out and got Steve Forbes' signatures. So that was an introduction into some activism back before I became a full-fledged big L libertarian.
Well, I was going to ask you about because we had just talked about Ayn Rand in the last episode of our podcast,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess I got Murray Rothbard garb all over the place. So I was going
Right,
to ask
right,
you,
right.
are you full fledged Rothbardian, or where do you kind of stand?
Um, I completely get the anarchy, and I completely get that's if you're going to apply the non-aggression principle, that's where you go.
Hmm.
That's just, I mean, that's just true, right? I think everybody's got their strengths about how they act in the liberty movement, just as a broader umbrella. And I ran for attorney general in Colorado 5 or 6 years ago, whenever that was, and I was focused on specific issues, specific statutes that I would hope to have some influence on, introduce people to some different ideas, and so that's where I focus is like on those margins where there might be some change, and I completely get it. Yes, ideally all drugs should be decriminalized. There should be no borders, and the military should be private. That's where it goes. But from what I do better. If I go into a room of people that are completely apolitical, like a Rotarian or whatever it is, and I can talk to them about how the war on drugs is bad and convince a lot of them to do that. It's not me to go in there and start off and try to tell them that we should legalize heroin. That's just not
Right.
what I do, right? So, and I think that's good. I think what I do or try to do is move people in that direction. I kind of look at it as almost like I've heard this before. It's not my analogy, but like a gateway drug to Rothbard, basically. And I actually heard that applied to Ron Paul. It's like Ron Paul is not an anarchist, but how many people got introduced to the very idea and went that way, right?
Hmm.
So that's how I look at things from a practical point, and I hope that makes some sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense, and I mean, even I've found that as I approach practice too, um, when you get in the trenches, so to speak, things don't appear to be so black and white. And I remember when I started getting into this my first or second year of law school, and I guess so it's been about 2 or 3 years now. But once I started getting in the real world, you can sit in your chair and read books and kind of say how things should be.
Right,
But once you get in the real world and when you play around with that, you realize things are a lot more complicated. And that's not to say you should throw out principle at all, but
right,
it's tough. So
right.
how have you approached that?
Well, for example, like that Masterpiece Cake Shop, which
Yeah.
famous case came out here. That's going on in North Carolina when I was running for Attorney General, or at least part of it was. And I went out and met that guy. I knew somebody who knew him, so I went out and talked to Jack Phillips. He's the actual baker. And so I was just trying to point out to people during that entire campaign is because it was a Republican Attorney General's office that was prosecuting him under the State Civil Rights Act, and that's a real thing. That's something that was actually going on, and it still is. And it affected a real person with a real statute, and pointing out that there's a conflict there with the state statute, the state regulatory body, the Civil Rights Commission, and the First Amendment, and say, and asking the question, what is real progress? You're trying to talk to progressives. What is real progress? Is it making people do something against their will? Is it threatening them with a gun to bake a cake? And a lot of people don't get all this, because I've read the ALJ opinion and read the U.S. Supreme Court opinion and all that. He had no problem. He sold these same people goods. It wasn't like he refused to sell goods to homosexuals. He refused to make a cake for a wedding ceremony. All right, and that's an important distinction. I think a lot of people miss. He sold those people stuff all the time, and he still does. But it was for that specific ceremony that he thought was and considered it a religious ceremony that went against his religion. And I tried to make a point. What's real progress? Is real progress forcing him to do it, or is real progress having other people be able to do that willingly? I mean, and comparing it to 1964 Atlanta and how the Heart of Atlanta Hotel, the big civil rights 1964 case, how black people couldn't get a hotel room, period. There was no other place to go. But now you can Google gay wedding cakes, and you'll find 100 of them or more of people willing to do that. So that's progress. That's real progress. So let's continue that idea of changing people's minds and not threatening them with the government violence. And a lot of people don't even get that. So it's not government violence, right? He just has to sell this cake. Well, and explain to people how, well, if he doesn't do that, eventually they're going to shut down his business, because they're going to fine him first for contempt. Then they're going to come shut down his business. And if he resists any of that, that's when the guns come out. Right? If he's defending himself, what he believes is true. So, and I think people got that every single law is ultimately backed up by government violence, by a gun. And I think it's Professor Carter at Yale, and I'm drawing a blank on his first name, but he's a progressive guy, black gentleman. And he has talked about how, and so he talked to his first year law student classes about that same thing, that every law is ultimately enforced by the death penalty. And I think that's huge, and I've cited him a million times. And so I think that was a practical thing that I could do with a real life person and a real life example, to demonstrate to people how non-aggression really works. And it's better to convince somebody than it is to force them to do something. That's progress. And
Well, right, yeah,
there you go.
and being well, yeah, I find that valuable. Being the voice in the room that kind of has this very sad to say, it is a very unique perspective on this.
Right.
And I remember being that guy that always brought that up in my law school class, and then you'd get people kind of craning around looking, because I don't know if people really accept it, or, sometimes they would push back on that idea. That,
Right. Sure, they do. Absolutely.
And I don't know, you just got to Socratically hold their feet to the coals,
Right.
I guess.
Right. They one of the things you hear is that, well, if he just does what they tell him to do, there's no violence. Right.
Yeah.
So, and then you get to, well, that's what happens to a lot of the people that get shot by police. Right. Do what you're told and you won't get hurt is what hostages get told.
Right.
Not what people in a free society get told. And so I think there's some good examples there. And we can try to illustrate that to people.
Well, and so just as an aside here, do you know who Jordan Lawrence is?
Does not ring a bell.
Because so my understanding is that he was working on the Masterpiece Cake Shop and was representing Phillips. But he came to speak at a Federalist Society event that we had at my law school. And I didn't know exactly what his role was, but I knew he was representing Phillips in some capacity. But he was a super smart guy.
Yeah.
But just to get into that, were you satisfied with the Supreme Court's opinion? I mean, they basically just punted the football.
Yeah. Well, they definitely punted. Yeah, they absolutely punted. And I wrote a little bit about this. I mean, they said the Civil Rights Commission was overtly discriminatory against Jack Phillips' religion. Comparing these people that act like this are Nazis. I mean, they actually said that at one of the Civil Rights Commissioners said that.
Right.
And so the Supreme Court said there's no way you can get a fair trial if that's what one of your judges is saying.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, what that was basically saying is, you guys can do this again. This time, shut up and don't say shit like that. And then maybe it's okay. So yeah, it didn't. I mean, it didn't solve the issue. It was a victory for Jack Phillips on that matter, and it ended that prosecution of him. Well, enforcement action against him. But no, it didn't decide the issue at all. And I think next term they're going to have some cases that they will decide that eventually.
I mean, so it does kind of beg the question, like, okay, what if they compelled his speech without being overtly, harsh on
Right.
his religious perspective?
Right.
What
Right. They didn't get to that.
do you think there was a reason why they didn't? Because my conspiracy theory mind was like, well, they've seen how divided the country is right now. They just don't want to touch this issue, so they're gonna just punt it downfield.
I think that's a perfectly reasonable conclusion, right?
Yeah.
I think they might have been looking through it and they go, somebody was looking through the record. Do you see what this civil rights commissioner said about Jack Phillips? Yeah, oh man, okay, great. That'll give us a reason to kick it back without actually reaching the decision. Yeah, I think there's a lot of that politics going on behind the scenes with those 9 people, right? And they can go, hey, we can rule in favor of Jack Phillips, but not say that he can't be prosecuted for it.
Yeah.
Hey, who's down with that? Right.
Let's do it.
Right.
Yeah. Well, okay. So this is one thing that I've kind of been juggling too, is that, so in your practice, my firm that I'm involved with is very overtly political. It's on the left hand of it, but I'm actually the only attorney who is right leaning in the way of liberty, but they're all very progressive, maybe Elizabeth Warren progressive style. But they take a lot of police abuse cases though, and they fight against insurance companies and but against the police abuse and all that stuff too. So being out here, and I've had this show for quite a while, but how do you handle being a very radical libertarian and your career as well? And it seems like you've been involved with federal courts a bit more. So what has your experience been on that matter?
I think you just have got to pursue what you believe in and then just let the chips fall where they're going to fall. I get a lot of calls from people that are libertarian oriented on different things I don't do, but I can try to point them in a good direction. And that actually happened. You might have heard about this case, which I assisted on in the at the trial court level. It didn't go to trial. We knew this was going to be a summary judgment issue about the house in Greenwood Village, which is like almost a mile and a half away from where I'm sitting right now. I'm right in the south end of Denver. Greenwood Village is right over the line. Where the police chased a bad guy. No doubt he had robbed a Walmart, no one far away, and had a gun, and he had a history of drugs, and kind of not a guy you want to be out because he's a bad dude. He ran into what eventually became my client's house, and basically barricaded himself in. And the police surrounded it. They couldn't get him out. And after like 18 hours, they ended up using some of their rocket-powered grenade things to blow holes in the side of the house so they could see him. And they destroyed the house. I mean, it had to be demolished. And they weren't going to pay for the house. And so he came to me eventually because he had asked about libertarians, and he is a libertarian leaning guy. He's very much that way. And so he ended up coming to me. And my thought was, this is a takings case, right? You can't take for public purpose without compensation. And so and I was surprised to learn that this is not, there's no reported cases in the federal courts about this. This has not happened. Now, there's 2 cases that I thought were right on point from state courts. One of them ruled in favor of the private property owner, the innocent property owner who lost his property because a bad guy ran in and the police destroyed it. And there was another one where it came out the other way. So it was California that came out in favor of the police. It was Texas that came out in favor of the property owner. And so I thought we had a great case, a great argument here. And I got Rachel Maxim. I was smart enough to ask her to come on, and she did all the actual real work on the case. And we knew that, we knew it was going to be a summary judgment case because there's no facts at issue. This is what happened, right? Mm-hmm. And so it was decided on summary judgment against us. At that point, I was no longer involved with it, but Rachel is still pursuing that to the 10th Circuit and in state court. So that's still out there, and that's the type of thing where stuff can come to you if people know what you believe and they want somebody that believes that. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. But kind of like Howard Rourke, right? You got to do what you're going to do, and if nobody wants to hire you, then so be it. You got to be true to yourself.
Yeah. No, I think that's pretty good advice, and it's kind of how I've been handling things. But thankfully, I'm in a very good place. I started off in one firm, and I quickly decided that wasn't for me, and
Yeah,
then I got to a different place, and I mean it's real high caliber. The attorneys there, I'm with some great people, even if
yeah,
they are Elizabeth Warren types,
right,
But
right, right.
yeah, so it's tremendous, and it's a good place for me to grow. But um, that's what I've been doing so far is just trying to follow my heart, with this show and everything too. But
Yeah, yeah,
so talking more about like moral gray areas too.
yeah,
So a few issues that have come up as well is, you know, maybe being a Lysander Spooner guy, one thing you have to do when you're sworn in is swear allegiance to the Constitution, right?
right,
And that's one thing. Another thing is taking public defender appointments, knowing that the money comes from taxpayer funds,
right,
or suing the
right.
police, knowing that any judgment that you get will be paid out with taxpayer funds. Like, I mean,
Mhm.
at the end of the day, what do you do with that?
Right, right. Um, there. I maybe this isn't a great analogy, but it's how I kind of look at things. It helps me. Is that there's battlefronts, and that's where the fight is. And if the fight is to protect somebody who's been abused by the police and had their civil rights violated and beat up or killed or whatever,
Yeah,
that's where that fight is protecting that guy and protecting people like him. And by fighting the fight there, I mean that's where it is. I mean you can't go. We don't have the option to go fight to stop taxes going to this guy or for any verdict that he might get. Um, I mean, you could go and lobby, you could go do that kind of stuff, sure. But this fight is still there for this guy. And that fight has to be fought. And if we can stop all of that, then we have moved the battlefront closer to where we want it to be. And so um, uh, that's how I feel about it. I think it's justified to fight the battle line to get where you're going to go. I mean, you can't get from point A to point D in a war without going through B, C, and D, or B, C before you get to D. And to me, that's how I look at it. It is an incremental step towards the right direction, and it involves an actual human being who's actually been hurt that does need to be compensated for that. And then you can use the example. You can then go, hey, this is taxpayer money. So everybody in this jurisdiction who voted for this city council that hired this chief of police that allowed this to go on should be removed or do something about it. And it's an example of something we can hold up and show. This is what happens. Stop this from happening. And one of my examples is, if each individual law enforcement officer had to have his own personal insurance policy for types of things like that, once a guy gets in trouble once, he
yeah,
can't be
right,
insured anymore.
yeah,
Nobody's going to insure him anymore, or his rates are going to be up, really, really high. So that way, the market weeds out these cops. But right now, they don't lose anything. If they beat somebody to death, wrongfully, they don't lose a thing. But at least if they had to have their own insurance policy and the insurer would have to pay that out, that guy's not going to have a policy anymore and he can't work anymore. So I think that gives him some practical way, or gives society some practical way to deal with that. And but that's not where the fight is yet. We got to get the fight there. So
yeah,
that's how I look at it.
yeah. And I mean, a lot of it too is just trying to affect the culture because I don't know, you now being a part of the community and interacting with it and interacting with people and clients, you really kind of get a better pulse on what people's thought processes are. And I'm telling you, like, I mean, this maybe isn't a shocker to everyone who would be listening to this show, but people are not there at all.
Right.
I mean, they're
Exactly.
just not. They're not even in the same ballpark.
Right.
So in some ways, it's kind of depressing. But again, you're there. You're in the trenches. You're doing something about it.
You're trying, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think a good example of this, kind of changing the topic a little bit, but Maj Toure in Philadelphia,
Yeah.
the Libertarian running for city council, I love Maj Toure. And he's got a lot of flack recently because he said some stuff about closed borders. I'm like, all right, he's in the arena fighting for Philadelphia and a place that needs help. It's got his position would have nothing to do with immigration policy, right? Nothing to do with it. So let's lay off of him. Libertarians don't beat him up for this. He's trying to do something good in his community for the office he's running for. So let's support him for that. And we just want to eat ourselves alive all too often. It's more important to be Lysander Spooner than it is to get elected. And I know people go, oh Dave, oh man, you're being unprincipled if you don't attack Maj Toure for not being an open border guy, even though he's running for city council of Philadelphia. And I'm like, well, sorry, I
Yeah.
actually want to do something. And if you want to sit back and be pure, do it. Great, you can be the North Star that we can all strive for. We need that. Great. Some of us are trying to get there. So let's try to get there. And that's the way. I know that's the way. I know a lot of the ANCAP type people hate that, but I'm unapologetic about that. I'm pro Maj Toure because he's running for city council. He wants to stop police abuse. He wants to protect Second Amendment rights. Those are things he can actually do as a city council person in Philadelphia. So let's support him on that.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah,
agree.
that's my thought.
I agree entirely. I think, there was a point in time when I was very early in this journey where I was all about purity and
Mm-hmm.
principle and all that. But there's always someone who is more pure and principled than you are,
Yeah,
especially if they're not involved in the shit that you're doing on the front line. You
right.
know, and
Exactly. And,
and
and I don't see them as being at odds either. I
right.
mean, I think one person is saying this is where we got to go, and maybe I may call them the map maker or whatever. This is where we need to go. This is our destination. And then there are people like Lewis and Clark that are trying to get there. You
Yeah.
know, and so you need both of them. So
Yeah.
I don't think they're at odds. And so
Okay.
that's how I kind of reconcile the two.
Yeah, well, I mean, so in my own thinking, perhaps I think it can be counterproductive if all we get, there, you need equal measure of both. I guess I wouldn't condemn people who are
Right? No,
principled.
exactly.
I try to be as principled as possible, but there's a point where it just gets to be not very progressive. You can't go
Mm-hmm.
anywhere with it. And it demoralizes people, I think, too. I mean, there was a point in time with which I was considering kind of hanging up the boots because people were criticizing me so much
Right.
that it felt like you're not really getting anything done. Um,
Right.
I got a huge backlash when I was admitted to the bar, you know,
Yeah.
and a lot of times it's people who either they've had bad experiences themselves with attorneys and now they're ANCAPs and they just hate everyone on principle because of
Right.
that, because they've had their bad
Yeah.
experiences and
Yep.
it's
Um,
yeah.
Oh, and another example of that out here in Colorado, when we legalized recreational marijuana, I was on the speakers bureau for that, and basically my role was to go talk to like the Tea Party groups because that was a big thing back then, and some of the more conservative groups, and make the limited government argument in favor of legalizing marijuana for medical. I'm sorry, for recreational use. We already had it for
Mhm.
medical, and a lot of people were like, "Well, all you're doing is the government's just going to tax it, and then you can have another set of regulations, another regulatory body." Absolutely. You're right. That is true. But regulation is a step closer to where we want to be than incarceration.
Right.
Right? It's
Yeah.
like Jesse Jackson with my rhymes. So no, I don't want the regulation. I don't want the new body of government authorities telling people what they can and can't do with weed. But that is better than putting people in jail for it. So that's where I stand on that type of thing. That's a practical way to get closer to where we want to be. It's not the end. It's a step in that direction.
Yeah. And man, what my grandfather was a John Bircher, right? And he died when I was a little kid, but he's someone who, my family always tells me that I remind them of is him. And
Right.
so I try and emulate him, and I have a newspaper scrap that I haven't shared with my audience yet, but it's a story that he wrote against Iraq War 1
Wow.
back
Yeah.
in the 80s. And it's all the same rhetoric that we're using, that he changed his mind over. We saw what Vietnam did and all that. But he had a lot of isms, and he was a really smart guy. But one of them
Mm-hmm.
was little by little. You you don't become Clarence Darrow in one day.
Right.
You look at
Right.
your calendar and you take it one day at a time, and do everything you can in that one day to become Clarence Darrow with that. He's a famous attorney for y'all who don't follow the
He did
inside
the Scopes monkey
baseball.
trial,
Yeah.
among many other things.
So, why don't you tell me a little bit about when you were a very young attorney, and so it can be very intimidating to try and get into the courtroom and develop your skills, and just dealing with, I guess, the pressure and anxiety of it all.
Yeah, I first the magistrate judge that I worked for my first year out of law school. My first year with a government, with a law job with the government, with the federal government, learned a lot about that. And that was a great job because my boss was great. Um, so I felt like I was helping do stuff there. And I wasn't as hardcore as a libertarian at the time, but yeah, it was tax money. But I got to see the waste of the federal court system. Like some judges, federal judges can go on part-time status in essence, and they still get paid the same amount. So does their staff, and they're not on full-time status anymore. Just examples like that, and there's even worse examples. But so being able to be there and see it is a helpful thing to do. And so that was enjoyable. And then when I got my first real job for the insurance defense firm back in Greensboro, which is where I went to high school, um, I guess I really learned the practical thing I learned was it's the different humans you have to work with is probably more important than anything else. Even if you love the cause, if you're working for an asshole, it's not worth it.
Right. Yeah.
And so I did, that thought never crossed my mind before. I was like, oh man, I'm going to do what I love doing, and it's going to be great. Because I guess I really had to deal with that, through school, and even when I was with the judge. So that is something I would advise to tell anybody. If you're in a job where whatever it is, if you're not enjoying it, if you're working for an asshole, get another job. And if it's bad enough, just quit and find another job. Because I tried to make it work in Greensboro I didn't stay there a full year, but that was a hard time for me. So,
Yeah.
but I got into courtrooms, I got to do depositions, and it did meet some good people. And actually, when that firm broke up a couple years later, two of the guys that left that firm asked me to come join them. So that was good, right? Um, but you've got to. I think to be a litigator, you've got to love being in the courtroom, which I did, and it is a performance type thing. I had one of my it might have been, I think it was my very first solo trial, and I went in the second chair, insurance defense case, and the plaintiff had been he played football at NC State, and he played in the Canadian Football League, and he was a defensive back. And in closing, and at one point he had said something, and he kind of changed it a little bit. And in closing argument, I made some analogy to the fact that he was backpedaling, which is what defensive backs do,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So if nobody, I amused myself with that, And at one point, I said somebody was too big and too strong to be intimidated, which is a line from Bull Durham. You're too big, you're too strong, and I think that type of thing keeps it. It's part of the entertainment role, and if you're before a jury, that's a large part of it. I mean, Johnny Cochran. If you want to look at an example of a famous guy who was awesome, right? And there's a lot more of those. There's some theatrics to it, and if that's what you want to do, embrace it. But if you want to be an appellate lawyer, you don't have to worry about it. Or if you want to work for a bank, because I know people that did that. You're doing banking stuff, and great, if that's your thing, awesome. Because that's one thing I tell young people that talk about law school. And what do you think about being a lawyer? Well, you can do anything with a law degree, and make those examples. You can work for the government as a prosecutor. You can work for the government as a lobbyist. You can work as a government in a regulatory agency. You can go out on your own and defend people. You can work for a bank. You can work for a company. You can work for a big company, small. You can do anything with it. So just do what you want to do with it. Don't think you have to do anything in particular. That's because you really can do anything with it. And there's a lot of lawyers that don't practice law also. I know a lawyer that went to law school and decided he knew he wasn't going to practice. He didn't even take the bar, but now he's doing other stuff that's, he's doing very well with it. So listen to your Jiminy Cricket or whatever. Do what you want to do. Life is not worth doing something just because you think you're supposed to, or you've been told to. Follow what you want to do, and then you'll be happy.
Yeah.
And you learn. You can always change your mind too. I mean,
your
you
story
should.
is very similar to my first 7 months of practice. I mean, almost to a T. Yeah. So I could have talked to you in December. That would have really helped me out too.
Right. Well,
But
hopefully it'll help somebody. And it's not. It applies to anything. Not just law firms.
yeah, it does for sure. And it was through the process of trying to get my bearings straight that I found this job that I'm at now. So,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
but you're right. Life is too short to sit around with a shitty boss or be in a situation you just can't stand. So, um,
Indeed.
well, what do you have any other war stories before we close things up here?
Just kind of one thing that popped in my mind that has always amused me. I was representing somebody in an appointed case, and it wasn't a criminal case. It was a contempt case because the guy had gotten behind on child support. And out here in Colorado, if you can be found in contempt because you're not obeying a court order. I mean, if they can find that you've got the ability to do it or you had the ability to do it, they can put you in jail for contempt of court. And so it's in a courtroom. It was an afternoon. It was an empty courtroom except for the 5 or 6 people that were involved with it. And the other attorney is talking, and I'm sitting at the desk with my guy, and all of a sudden his phone goes off, which is bad enough, right, in a courtroom. But what makes it funny, it really is funny. His ringtone
Was it fuck the
was
police?
no,
Oh,
that would have
okay.
been good too. No, it was gunshots firing.
Oh
I
no,
kid you not, it was
that's
gunshots
worse.
firing.
Oh,
So I could laugh about it now. Luckily, the judge, I just looked at him and said, "Turn it off," basically. Yeah, but that was I love that. Just how dumb can you be? I mean, it's not dumb. He just wasn't thinking about it.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I heard a story about a guy who was facing a sex charge. I heard this secondhand, and he showed up in court with a T-shirt that said, "Sex is a misdemeanor. The more I misdemeanor I get." And his
Oh
and his
no.
lawyer said, "What are you doing?" Right? And he made him turn it inside out. That's all he could do. So you run into some ridiculous things like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean that's why I wanted to become a lawyer because I was a creative writing major in
Mm-hmm.
undergrad, and useful,
Oh,
and it doesn't sound outwardly
no, it
useful,
is. It
but
is.
it
I complete
is.
again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I did have to learn how to I had to unlearn how to write and relearn how to write when I went to law school. It's kind of like a boot camp thing to me,
Yeah.
just deconstructing and then reconstructing. But I love the stories, man, and that's really what drive. It does help you remember fact patterns when they're
Yeah.
in a narrative like that, as opposed to law school. But yeah, those war stories, they're my current one of the so there's 3 attorneys in my firm, and both of them have been practicing for a very long time. um One actually represented me when I was a baby, and that's how I
Yeah.
ended up getting my foot in the door. It was a products liability case against Graco because I fell down the stairs when I was in a walker at a babysitter's
Wow.
house. Yeah, so I
Yeah.
mean, I got this huge scar on the side of my head,
Oh
and
man.
so my mom is a legal professional, and in a way I was born into this world. Like, I don't know. So she said, "Well, you're gonna look real good to juries. I mean, you would stand out because you got that big scar on your head. Now you got this story. You're
Right.
superficially
Right.
charming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So yeah, but yeah, it's been a real good journey so far, and I'm just enjoying the ride, man. And
Awesome.
I really
Awesome.
appreciate talking to you and getting your
Yeah.
insight on things. And
No, thank you for having me. Yeah, shoot me. Anybody can contact me and ask me a question or ask me about something. I'm down.
yeah, sounds in using those resources, and it's nice to like Stefan Kinsella and other libertarian league lawyers and legal professionals. I think we got to rely on each other and bring up younger new libertarian lawyers, because
Hmm.
it's that connection. Whether it's in your professional legal career, making a network and networking locally, well, fostering that nationally is important, I think, too. Um,
Absolutely, that's great. Yep.
so yeah, well, I'll have to, because I guess we could talk all day about those cases that we were talking about in the beginning. So I'll have to shoot one your way once I get another one, and we can just go ham on it or something.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be great. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things came out of the Supreme Court this term. A lot of good ones to discuss. And let me pimp out my podcast. If
Yeah,
it's
I was
it's
gonna
the
say.
law with DK Williams, and it's on the Launchpad Media site. But if you there's a bunch of webcasts there, and check them all out, or podcasts there. But if you go to the Facebook page, which is the law with DK Williams Facebook page, you can just click on them there, and I'll take you right to the podcast. Or Google the law with DK Williams. So I'm up to episode I think I just did episode 40. Do one a week. I've missed like 2 weeks. But yeah, I started off with like some of the famous ones, Marbury v. Madison, Plessy v. Ferguson, and those. And but most recently, I've been trying to do more current ones because new cases are coming out, right, that impact us right now, and it's interesting to see, how the Supreme Court got there. So check it out. Let me know what you think, and you can hit me up at Blue Carp, which is my Twitter handle at Blue Carp, like the color in the fish. And yeah, find me there. Let me know what you think, and give me ideas, and I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, sounds awesome, and definitely highly recommended podcast for me. You got some great content, so I'd recommend everyone who enjoys this show will probably enjoy yours as well. And we'll put all those links in the show notes page at
Awesome.
libertyweekly.net/123.
I like it. 1, 2, 3. I can remember that.
Yeah, it's pretty simple, huh? Once you've been doing this for a while, you start to remember which episode number you talked about which show, so you can just pull it out of
That's
your
awesome.
ass. Yeah. So, well,
Well,
really appreciate it. Take care.
thank you, Patrick.